The air was so cold it felt like shattered glass in the lungs, a solid thing that could cut you from the inside out. In the winter of 1894, after a 9-day blizzard had entombed Carbon County, Wyoming, in a shroud of ice and silence, the world had stopped moving. Nothing stirred, not a bird, not a deer, not a man. That is, until the darkness of the abandoned Silver Creek mine exhaled a plume of warm breath. From that black opening, a boy emerged, not yet 14 years old, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes clear and calm. He led a mare by a rope harness, and trotting faithfully at her side was a foal as white as the unforgiving snow that surrounded them. The posse of men, who had ridden out expecting to find the frozen corpse of an orphan, simply stood frozen themselves, their disbelief a thick, unbreathing stillness. They watched as Caleb Stone Mercer, the boy they had all dismissed as mad, led his horses out of a cursed grave into a dead world, both boy and beasts impossibly defiantly alive. This is a story that reminds us of the quiet strength found in forgotten places and the hope that can be nurtured, even in the deepest darkness. If this image of a lone boy against a frozen world speaks to you, please take a moment to let us know where you are listening from in the comments below. Your presence here, sharing in this journey, means a great deal. Be sure to leave a like if you believe in the power of survival, because the tale of how this boy came to stand as the only living soul moving with purpose across that desolate landscape is one that deserves to be heard, right through to its very end. It is a testament to a promise made in the dark, a promise kept against all odds, and a lesson in how the world's scorn can sometimes forge the most unbreakable of spirits. But to understand how a boy's desperate choice, fueled by the fading echo of his dead father's forgotten wisdom, led to this moment of impossible survival, we cannot begin here. We cannot start with the stunned silence of hardened men or the quiet victory in the frigid air. We must go back 4 years, to a time when Caleb's world was not one of ice and stone, but of sun-drenched pastures and the thunder of 100 hooves. We must return to the day his life on his family's thriving horse ranch near Rawlins was shattered, the day his world truly ended and this new, harsher one began. For it was in the ashes of that first life that the seeds of this incredible survival were sown, unknowingly, in the heart of a 9-year-old boy who had just lost everything. 4 years earlier, at the age of 9, Caleb Stone Mercer was a boy hollowed out by loss. The world had become a series of muted, grey moments following the swift, brutal finality of his parents' deaths. The transition from his family's sun-bleached ranch, a place filled with the familiar sounds of his father's calm voice and the nicker of horses he knew by name, to the sprawling, orderly empire of Randolph Blackwood, was a jarring descent into a different kind of cold. Blackwood's ranch was not a home. It was a machine for producing perfect horses, and Caleb, small and silent, was just another piece of equipment to be put to use. He arrived with a single canvas bag, containing a change of clothes and a worn leather-bound journal of his father's, its pages filled with sketches of horse anatomy and notes on their temperament. He was assigned a cot in a drafty tack room, the scent of oil soap and old leather, a poor substitute for the smell of his mother's kitchen. Randolph Blackwood was not a guardian in any meaningful sense of the word. He was a collector of valuable things, and he believed the orphan boy held the key to his father's almost mystical ability to tame wild horses. Blackwood was a man carved from the unforgiving Wyoming landscape, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a stillness that was more unnerving than any overt threat. He never raised his voice at Caleb. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a constant suffocating pressure, a silent demand for the boy to reveal secrets he barely understood himself. Blackwood saw the Mercer legacy not as a tragedy, but as an asset he had acquired. He provided Caleb with food, shelter, and grueling endless work, all while watching him with the predatory patience of a hawk circling its prey, waiting for the boy to become useful. Caleb's days fell into a rhythm of relentless labor that would have broken a grown man. He was awake before the first hint of dawn, his small hands breaking the ice in the water trough, the shock of the cold a brutal daily awakening. He mucked out stalls, his shoulders aching as he pitched load after load of soiled straw. He hauled heavy buckets of oats and water, his arms trembling with the strain, until calluses formed over the blisters on his palms. He groomed Blackwood's prized stallions, Horses worth more than his father's entire ranch had been, their powerful muscles twitching under his brush. It was a life measured not in days or weeks, but in the number of stalls cleaned, horses fed and harnesses polished. He was a ghost in the machine, a small tireless engine that kept a minor part of Blackwood's vast operation running smoothly. In the quiet moments when the physical exhaustion was at its peak, his mind would drift back to his own home. He remembered the scent of rain on dry sagebrush and the easy laughter of his father, John Mercer. He recalled his father's hands, large and gentle, as he showed Caleb how to read the flick of a horse's ear or the subtle shift of its weight. His father never broke a horse. He listened to it, understood its fears, and earned its trust. He would spend weeks with a wild mustang, moving with a quiet patience that seemed to calm the very air around them. Caleb would watch, mesmerized, as a creature that had known only fear would eventually lower its head and breathe softly into his father's outstretched hand. These memories were a source of both profound comfort and a deep, aching sorrow, a reminder of a world where kindness was strength. On Blackwood's ranch there was no such philosophy. Strength was dominance and kindness was a weakness to be exploited. Blackwood's methods were efficient, cold, and rooted in force. He used harsh bits, heavy hands, and an unyielding will to bend the animals to his command. Caleb watched in silence as spirited horses were reduced to trembling obedience, their eyes dulling with each passing day. The other ranch hands, hardened men who took their cues from their employer, treated Caleb with a detached indifference that was its own form of cruelty. They saw him not as a grieving child, but as the strange orphan who worked without complaint, a fixture of the stables as unremarkable as a saddle rack or a hay bale. He was utterly, completely alone, surrounded by people but invisible to them all. His only true companions were the horses themselves. In the deep quiet of the stables, long after the other hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Caleb would move between the stalls. He learned the unique personality of each animal, the nervous mare who calmed at the sound of his low humming, the old gelding who would rest his heavy head on Caleb's shoulder, the fiery young colt who only allowed Caleb to clean his hooves. He would whisper stories to them, fragments of memories of his father, his voice a soft murmur in the hay-scented darkness. These creatures, owned by a man he feared, gave him a connection to the life he had lost. They didn't judge him or demand anything from him. They simply existed alongside him, their warm, breathing presence a silent testament to a world beyond Blackwood's cold ambition. The years bled into one another, turning the 9-year-old boy into a wiry, resilient 13-year-old. The ceaseless work had forged a lean strength in his limbs, and his hands, though small, were tough and capable. He grew taller, but learned to make himself smaller, to move through the world without drawing attention. His silence became his shield. He watched everything, listened to the gossip of the ranch hands, noted which horses were favored and which were failing, and absorbed the brutal calculus of Blackwood's business. He learned that a horse's value was measured only by its pedigree, its strength, and its obedience. Any animal that fell short was a liability, a line item to be erased from the ledger with chilling finality. This education in cold-hearted pragmatism was a stark contrast to the lessons his father had taught him. John Mercer had believed every horse had a purpose, a spirit that deserved respect. He had once spent an entire winter nursing a lame foal back to health, an animal any other rancher would have put down without a second thought. That foal had grown up to become the lead mare of their herd, intelligent and fiercely loyal. Caleb clung to this memory as proof that his father's way was not only kinder, but better. He saw Blackwood's methods as a fundamental betrayal of the unspoken pact between man and horse, a pact his father had honored with his very soul. This quiet internal rebellion was all Caleb had, a flickering ember of defiance in the face of overwhelming power. The loneliness of his existence was absolute. Birthdays came and went, marked only by the changing angle of the sun. Holidays were just another day of work, the distant sounds of celebration from the main house serving only to deepen his isolation. He ate his meals quickly and alone in the tack room, the taste of the food as bland and functional as every other part of his day. He read his father's journal by the light of a single lantern, the familiar handwriting a tangible link to the past. The pages were filled not just with knowledge about horses, but with a philosophy of life, one of patience, respect, and understanding. It was a language of empathy in a world that only valued control. By the late summer of his 13th year, Caleb was no longer just a grieving boy. He was a survivor, honed by hardship into something sharp and observant. He understood the cycles of the seasons, the moods of the animals, and the cold, unchanging nature of the man who held his life in his hands. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that on this ranch to be deemed worthless was a death sentence. He had watched old horses and lame colts disappear, taken on a one-way ride to a distant pasture, and never spoken of again. He saw the same detached appraisal in Blackwood's eyes when the man looked at him. He was an asset whose value was diminishing, and he knew instinctively that his time was running out. The change arrived with the first cold snap of late August, a subtle shift in the air that carried the scent of dying leaves and the distant promise of frost. It was a warning that every creature in Wyoming understood in its bones. For Caleb, this seasonal turn was marked by one particular horse, an aging grey mare with a calm, intelligent gaze and a belly that was beginning to swell with new life. He didn't know her name. Blackwood rarely bothered with names for animals he considered mere stock. In the quiet of the evenings, Caleb had taken to calling her Esperanza, a word he'd found in an old book, a whisper of hope in the hay-dusted air. He would spend extra time in her stall, grooming her coarse coat until it shone, feeling the steady, rhythmic life within her. He saw in her a quiet endurance, a refusal to be broken that mirrored the stubborn pulse of his own heart. She was a living link to his father's world, a world where an animal's worth was not measured by its age, but by its spirit. The threat did not announce itself with a thunderclap, but with the low rumble of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. A prospective buyer had arrived from Cheyenne, a man with a ledger and a cold eye for horseflesh. Randolph Blackwood, usually a man of stone-like stillness, became almost animated in the presence of such business. He moved with a crisp, predatory energy, pointing out the flawless musculature of his prize stallions, his voice a low, persuasive hum of pedigrees and prices. Caleb felt the familiar tension descend upon the stables, the air growing thick with calculation. He and the other hands were expected to be invisible, to move with silent efficiency, presenting each horse for inspection as if it were a finely crafted machine. On these days, Blackwood's gaze was at its most dismissive, sweeping over Caleb as if he were nothing more than a piece of worn-out tack, a necessary but ultimately disposable part of the operation. That evening, long after the buyer's carriage had departed and a fragile peace had settled back over the ranch, Caleb was in the tack room adjacent to Blackwood's office, meticulously oiling a set of harnesses. The work was methodical, a familiar rhythm for his hands that allowed his mind to drift. The wall was thin, and he could hear the clink of a glass and the low murmur of Blackwood speaking with his foreman. Caleb worked on, the sounds a meaningless backdrop to his task, until a single name, spoken with sharp finality, made his hands freeze in mid-air. It was the name of the old grey mare, Esperanza. He stopped breathing, his entire being focused on the voices filtering through the wood, a sudden, cold dread coiling in his stomach. The familiar, safe scent of saddle soap and leather suddenly felt suffocating. The small room, a trap. Blackwood's voice was stripped of its earlier salesmanship, now flat and utterly devoid of sentiment. He spoke of culling the herd before winter, of cutting losses and maximizing feed efficiency. The foreman grunted in agreement. Then came the words that would alter the course of Caleb's life forever. Blackwood declared the pregnant mare was too old, her foal likely to be weak. She was, he stated with chilling pragmatism, no longer worth her feed or the space she occupied in the barn. His plan was simple and brutal. They would turn her out into the remote northern pasture in a few days, long before the first snow fell. It was a death sentence, delivered as casually as a weather forecast. The pasture was miles from shelter, with little forage and no protection from the wolves that descended from the mountains with the cold. No horse left there had ever survived a Wyoming winter. Caleb heard the foreman ask if they should wait until after she foaled. Blackwood's reply was a short, sharp laugh, a sound as dry and brittle as frozen leaves. He said it would be a waste of a good week's hay. There was no argument, no flicker of dissent. The decision was absolute, a business calculation that had no room for mercy. In that moment, Caleb understood the full, terrifying scope of Blackwood's worldview. Life was a ledger, and any entry that did not produce a profit was to be ruthlessly erased. The conversation in the office moved on to other matters, the price of grain, a broken fence line. But Caleb remained frozen, the finality of Blackwood's decree echoing in the sudden, roaring silence of his own mind. The impossibility of appealing to the man's humanity was a solid, unbreachable wall. The words did not just frighten him, they resonated with a terrifying, personal clarity. He was also an asset that was no longer profitable. He was a boy who held a secret Blackwood could not extract, a silent, unproductive reminder of a legacy the man could not possess. He, too, was not worth his feed. The cold dismissal of the mayor was a direct reflection of his own precarious existence. He was a line item on the same cold ledger, and he knew, with a certainty that iced his blood, that his own time would eventually come. The fate of the mayor was a preview of his own. Blackwood was not just discarding an animal, he was demonstrating the reach of his power and the utter worthlessness of any life that did not serve his ambition. He backed away from the wall slowly, his movements as silent as a shadow. He slipped out of the tack room and into the cool night air, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't run. He walked with a deliberate, numb purpose directly to Esperanza's stall. The mare turned her head as he approached, her dark eyes soft in the lantern light. She nudged his shoulder gently and let out a low, rumbling sigh. Caleb leaned his forehead against her warm, solid flank, feeling the faint, rhythmic kicks of the life she carried inside. This was the tangible evidence, the living, breathing proof of what Blackwood intended to destroy. It was not an abstract number on a page. It was a mother and her unborn child. It was a life that deserved a chance, a life that was completely, utterly defenseless. Standing there in the quiet darkness of the stable, surrounded by the smell of hay and the soft sounds of sleeping horses, something inside Caleb shifted. The fear that had gripped him for 4 long years did not vanish, but it was joined by a new, harder emotion, a cold, unyielding rage. He thought of the other horses, the ones who had grown old or lame and had simply disappeared. He had accepted it then, a helpless child in a world of brutal rules. But he was not a child anymore. He would not stand by and watch this happen. He would not let Blackwood's casual cruelty win. The decision was not even a conscious thought. It was a visceral, absolute certainty that rose from the deepest part of his soul. He would save her. He would save them both. He did not know how, but as he ran a hand down Esperanza's neck, he made a silent, unbreakable vow to the darkness. This time, Blackwood would not erase a life from his ledger. This time he would fail. The vow made in the darkness of the stable was not a child's wishful promise. It was the forging of an iron will. The fear that had been Caleb's constant companion for 4 years did not disappear, but it changed its shape. It was no longer a paralyzing fog, but a whetstone, sharpening his resolve into a fine, dangerous edge. He was done being a ghost, done being a victim of Blackwood's cold arithmetic. In that moment, leaning against the warm, living weight of the mare, he felt the presence of his father not as a painful memory, but as a source of quiet, unyielding strength. His father had never bowed to cruelty, had never accepted that power was the same as right. The decision to act was not a choice made with his mind. It was an answer given by his soul. He would not just save Esperanza. He would defy the very foundation of Blackwood's world, a world built on the belief that the vulnerable were disposable. His mind, now clear and focused, raced to find a solution, a place of sanctuary. And then it came to him, a memory surfacing from the deep well of his past. He was a small boy, walking a ridge with his father, who had pointed toward a dark opening in a distant hillside. It was the Silver Creek Mine, a place of ghosts and bad luck. But his father, a practical man who saw the world for what it was, had spoken not of curses but of geology. He explained how the earth itself was a blanket, how deep mines held a steady, cool temperature in the summer, and more importantly, a constant survivable warmth in the winter, insulated from the deadliest cold. The memory, once a simple lesson from a father to his son, now became the cornerstone of a desperate plan, The mine's cursed reputation was not a deterrent, it was camouflage. No one would ever think to look for him there. The next 3 days were a masterclass in invisibility. Caleb performed his chores with the same outward silence, the same mechanical efficiency, but his senses were alive in a way they had never been before. He was no longer just working, he was studying. He memorized the precise timing of the foreman's rounds, noting the 7-minute gap when the west end of the stables was completely unobserved just after midnight. He learned the specific creak of the bunkhouse door that signaled the last ranch hand had turned in for the night. He watched the patterns of the moon, calculating which nights would offer the deepest darkness for his work. He became a student of the ranch's rhythms, not as a servant within them, but as a predator learning the habits of its prey. He was searching for a flaw in the fortress, a single moment of inattention that would be his only gateway to survival. His preparations were small, quiet acts of theft and rebellion. He began to gather resources, taking only things that would not be immediately missed. A handful of oats skimmed from the bottom of a barrel, secreted away in a canvas sack. A length of old but sturdy rope, coiled and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the tack room. He found a rusted but serviceable farrier's knife in an abandoned line shack, and spent an hour sharpening its edge on a smooth river stone. His most important prize was a heavy, patched wool blanket, one he knew was used for sick calves, and was stored in a dusty corner of the feed shed. Each item was a small victory, a tangible piece of his plan. He carried them one by one, under the cover of darkness, to a hollowed-out cottonwood log, a quarter-mile from the path that led toward the old mine. The weight of his decision settled on him during the quiet hours, when he lay on his narrow cot, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. The sheer audacity of his plan was terrifying. He was a boy, barely 13 years old, with no money, no allies, and no weapon beyond his own stubbornness. He was planning to defy Randolph Blackwood, a man who could crush him without a second thought, a man who owned the sheriff and the law in this part of the county. The fear would rise in his throat, cold and suffocating, whispering of failure, of being caught and dragged back to a punishment he couldn't even imagine. But then, he would close his eyes and picture Esperanza, her quiet dignity, and the unborn foal she carried. He would remember Blackwood's mocking laughter. The cold rage would return, burning away the fear and leaving only a hard, clear certainty in its place. He had a close call 2 nights before his planned departure. He was making his way back from his hidden cache of supplies when he heard the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching on the main path. He threw himself flat behind a dense thicket of sagebrush, his heart hammering against the hard ground. It was Blackwood himself, riding back late from a neighboring ranch. The man reined in his horse not 20 feet from where Caleb lay, a dark, imposing silhouette against the starry sky. Caleb held his breath, certain he had been seen. Blackwood scanned the darkness, his head turning slowly, as if he sensed a disruption in his perfectly ordered world. For a full minute the world stood still. Then, with a slight shake of the reins, Blackwood urged his horse forward, disappearing toward the main house. Caleb remained on the ground long after he was gone, the cold sweat on his skin a stark reminder of how close he was to the edge. The chosen night finally arrived, as dark and moonless as he had hoped. He performed his evening chores with a strange, hollow feeling in his chest, a sense of an ending. As he moved through the stables, he allowed himself a final silent farewell. He ran a hand down the nose of the old gelding, who would sometimes rest his head on his shoulder. He whispered a quiet goodbye to a young filly he had helped nurse through a fever. These animals had been his only family for 4 years, silent witnesses to his loneliness. Leaving them felt like a betrayal, a sharp pang of guilt that he had to swallow down. This was his point of no return. He could not save them all. He could only save the one that Blackwood had already condemned, and in doing so, perhaps save himself. As the last light faded from the sky and a profound silence fell over the ranch, Caleb knew the time had come. He had overheard the foreman telling another hand that Blackwood would be gone for 2 days, attending a horse auction in Cheyenne. It was the perfect window of opportunity, the flaw in the system he had been waiting for. He slipped from his cot, his small bundle of supplies clutched tightly in his hand. The air outside was cold and sharp, carrying the first real bite of the coming winter, a stark reminder that his time was running out. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing footstep. With his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, he moved not toward the open plains of freedom, but toward the dark, cursed mouth of the Silver Creek mine, his only hope in a world that had left him for dead. The moment the bunkhouse door clicked shut for the last time, a profound and heavy silence descended upon the ranch, a stillness that was both a shield and a threat. Caleb moved through it not like a boy, but like a whisper of wind. His first action was to retrieve the bundled supplies from beneath his cot, the weight of the rope and the small sack of oats, a grounding reality in his hands. He slipped out into the biting night air, his socked feet making no sound on the packed earth. The stables were a familiar labyrinth, but tonight every shadow seemed to hold a hidden observer, every rustle of hay a potential alarm. He moved directly to Esperanza's stall, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He didn't use a lantern. He trusted his hands, his memory, and the low, welcoming nicker the mare gave as he approached. She knew him. In the absolute darkness, this small sign of trust was everything. He unlatched her stall door, the metal catch sliding open with a soft, oiled click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. Leading her out of the relative warmth of the barn was the first true test of his nerve. The main stable door was secured by a heavy wooden bar, and lifting it required all of his wiry strength. He braced himself, his muscles straining, and slowly, carefully, raised the bar from its cradle. The wood groaned in protest, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the cavernous space. Caleb froze, every muscle tensed, his ears straining for any sign of discovery. He waited for a full minute that stretched into an eternity, listening to the pounding of his own blood. Nothing. Only the sound of the wind sighing around the eaves of the barn. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and gently nudged the heavy door open just wide enough for the mare to pass through, the cold night air rushing in to greet them like an icy slap. He slipped through behind her, carefully lowering the bar back into place, an act that felt like sealing a tomb behind him. Once outside, the world became a terrifyingly open space. The main yard was a moonless expanse of pale dirt, with the dark, hulking shape of Blackwood's house looming like a sleeping giant on the rise. Caleb knew that to cross that open ground was to risk being seen by a sleepless eye at a window. He kept to the shadows, his hand firm on Esperanza's lead rope, guiding her along the dark lines cast by the granary and the blacksmith's shed. The mare, sensing his urgency, moved with a quiet, careful tread, her hooves making only soft thuds on the earth. Each step was a gamble. He felt 1,000 invisible eyes on his back, the weight of Blackwood's entire empire pressing down on him. His plan, so clear and logical in the safety of his cot, now felt like a child's foolish fantasy, a fragile thing that could be shattered by a single stray beam of lantern light. They were halfway to the first pasture gate when a sudden sharp bark split the night. It came from the direction of the foreman's cabin, where a territorial cattle dog was chained. Caleb's heart seized in his chest. He froze instantly, pulling Esperanza to a halt behind the bulk of a water trough. He pressed a hand to her neck, trying to calm her and himself, his own breath catching in his throat. The dog barked again, a frantic, insistent sound. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, convinced this was the end. He pictured the foreman emerging with a lantern, his face a mask of anger. But the barking was not directed at them. It was aimed at the distant cry of a coyote on the ridge. After a few more half-hearted yaps, the dog fell silent. The danger had passed, a random stroke of luck, but it left Caleb trembling, the adrenaline a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He pressed on, his fear now a cold, hard knot in his stomach. The next barrier was the fence line bordering the sprawling north pasture, the very place Blackwood had intended to leave the mare to die. It was 5 strands of tightly strung barbed wire, a cruel and effective cage. Panic flared in him for a moment. It seemed impassable. But then a memory surfaced, a gift from his father. He remembered walking this very fence line years ago, his father pointing out a section near the creek bed, where the posts were old and rotted at the base. He had explained that a smart rancher always knew the weak points of his own defenses. Guided by this ghostly advice, Caleb led Esperanza down the gentle slope toward the sound of trickling water, his hands searching the darkness for the familiar feel of weathered, unstable wood. He found it almost immediately, a post that gave slightly under his weight. Getting the heavily pregnant mare through the gap was a slow, agonizing process. He used a thick piece of fallen cottonwood branch to press down the bottom strand of wire, creating a small opening. The barbs snagged on his jacket. Tearing the fabric, he ignored it, focusing only on the task. He whispered to Esperanza, his voice low and steady, coaxing her forward. She was hesitant, her instincts warning her against the sharp, unfamiliar barrier. She trusted him, but she was afraid. He had to gently but firmly guide her, pushing on her flank while holding the wire down, his muscles screaming with the strain. Her hide scraped against a barb and she flinched but didn't bolt. Finally she was through, and he scrambled after her, his hands raw and bleeding from a scrape with the wire. They were free of the ranch's immediate confines, but the vast, dark wilderness ahead offered no real safety. Only a different kind of danger. Now the true journey began, a desperate race against the coming dawn. The land stretched out before them, a rolling sea of sagebrush and rock under a starless sky. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through his thin clothes and chilling him to the bone. Esperanza, burdened by her pregnancy, moved at a slow, plodding pace. Caleb found himself constantly looking back over his shoulder, expecting to see the bobbing lights of a pursuit party. Every shadow looked like a horseman. Every gust of wind sounded like a shouted command. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was an amplifier for his fear. He knew they were leaving a clear trail, one that would be laughably easy to follow in the daylight. Their only hope was to reach the mine before the sun rose, to be swallowed by the earth before Blackwood's world awoke. The darkness, which had been his ally, soon became an enemy. Without the moon to guide him, the familiar contours of the land became a disorienting maze. The rolling hills all looked the same, the distant ridges indistinguishable silhouettes. A cold wave of panic washed over him as he realized he was no longer certain of his direction. He had been following a game trail, but it had petered out into a field of thick, thorny brush. He stopped, forcing himself to take a deep, shuddering breath. To wander aimlessly was to guarantee capture. He closed his eyes, blocking out the confusing landscape, and tried to picture the map in his head, the one his father had sketched in the dirt so many years ago. He remembered the distinctive shape of one particular butte, a formation that looked like a sleeping giant. He scanned the horizon, his eyes straining in the gloom, and there it was, a faint outline against the slightly less black sky. He had drifted west. He corrected their course, his heart still pounding, and pushed onward. The hours bled together into a single extended moment of grueling effort. His legs ached with a deep, burning fatigue, and his earlier adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. He stumbled over rocks, his ankles twisting, but he always caught himself, driven by the knowledge that to fall was to fail. He stopped once beside a small, ice-rimmed creek to let Esperanza drink. As she lowered her head, he splashed the frigid water on his own face, the shock of the cold a brutal but necessary jolt to his senses. He watched her drink, her sides heaving with effort, and felt a surge of protective determination. She was depending on him completely. He could not let her down. He could not let Blackwood win. He tore a strip of cloth from the bottom of his shirt and gently cleaned the scrape on her flank from the wire fence. As they began the slow, arduous climb into the foothills where the mine was located, a stroke of luck descended upon them. A thick bank of ground fog, born from the cold air meeting the slightly warmer earth, began to roll in, blanketing the landscape in a soft grey shroud. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. It was a terrifying development, making it even harder to navigate the increasingly treacherous terrain. But Caleb recognized it for the gift it was. The fog was a curtain, a shield that would hide their tracks and their movement from any searching eyes. It erased them from the world. Emboldened by this unexpected cloak of invisibility, he picked up the pace, urging Esperanza forward into the disorienting mist, the world shrinking to just the few feet of rocky ground directly in front of them. The final ascent was the most perilous part of the journey. The ground grew steep, and was littered with loose shale that shifted and slid under their weight. Twice, Esperanza slipped, her hooves struggling for purchase on the unstable rock. Caleb had to brace himself, using his own body as an anchor to keep her from sliding back down the slope. He could feel her trembling, not from cold, but from exhaustion. He spoke to her constantly, his voice a low murmur of encouragement, a thread of sound in the muffled, foggy silence. He was running on pure will now, his body a numb, aching machine. He focused on a single thought. Just one more step, and then another, and another after that. He was no longer thinking about Blackwood or the ranch. His entire universe had contracted to this single, desperate task of moving this one horse up this one hill. And then they were there. It appeared suddenly out of the fog, a dark, gaping wound in the side of the hill, blacker than the surrounding rock. The entrance to the Silver Creek mine. The air around it felt different, still and strangely devoid of the biting wind. A wave of relief so intense it almost buckled his knees washed over Caleb. He stood for a moment, just breathing, the lead rope slack in his hand. He had done it. Against all odds he had brought her here. The journey was over. He looked back into the dense fog that had protected them, then turned to the profound darkness of the mine entrance. He knew this was not an ending but a beginning. With a final weary tug on the rope, he led the exhausted mare out of the dying night and into the deep, quiet earth, leaving the world of Randolph Blackwood behind forever. The moment Caleb guided Esperanza over the threshold of the mine, the world changed. The relentless, biting wind that had been their tormentor for hours simply ceased to exist, its howl cut off as if by a closing door. The darkness inside was absolute, a physical presence that felt heavier and more profound than the starless night they had just left. It was a blackness that swallowed sound, creating a silence so complete that Caleb could hear the frantic thumping of his own heart and the soft, wet sound of the mare's breathing beside him. But with the silence came an immediate and overwhelming sense of relief. The air, though damp and smelling of cold stone and wet earth, was noticeably warmer, a stable, insulated stillness that promised a reprieve from the lethal cold that was already beginning to claim the world outside. This was not a shelter, it was a tomb, but for the first time in 4 years, it felt like a sanctuary. His first priority was light. The oppressive darkness was disorienting, and he needed to see the space they now occupied. Fumbling in his small canvas sack, his fingers numb and clumsy, he found the flint and steel he had taken from the blacksmith's shed. He struck them together, the sparks a series of fleeting, brilliant stars in the void. After several tries, a spark caught on the small piece of tinder he'd prepared, and he carefully lit the wick of a single precious tallow candle. The flames sputtered to life, a tiny, fragile sun that pushed back the immense darkness, revealing not a narrow tunnel but a vast cavern. The ceiling was lost in the shadows above them, and the walls were a rugged tapestry of grey and black rock, glistening with moisture. The small flickering light cast their shadows, huge and distorted, against the ancient stone, making them look like giants in a forgotten world. He led Esperanza deeper into the chamber, his eyes scanning for immediate dangers, loose rock, deep pits, or signs of collapse. The ground was uneven, but mostly solid, a floor of packed earth and stone debris. He found a relatively level area, sheltered by a massive outcropping of rock, and decided this would be their first resting place. The mare, sensing the pause in their desperate journey, let out a long, weary sigh and lowered her head, her body trembling with exhaustion. Caleb took the small bag of oats he had carried and poured a meager handful onto a flat stone for her. It was a pathetic amount, but it was all he had. Watching her eat, he felt the full weight of his own fatigue crash down upon him. The adrenaline that had fueled his escape was gone, leaving behind a bone-deep ache and a mind hollowed out by fear and exertion. He needed to rest, if only for a moment. He slid down the rock wall, his back pressed against the unyielding cold stone, the chill of it seeping through his thin shirt. He didn't care. The simple act of being still, of not having to look over his shoulder for pursuers, was a luxury he hadn't known he was craving. He closed his eyes and the events of the night replayed in his mind. The creak of the barn door, the dog's bark, the terrifying feel of the barbed wire. He had done it, he had actually done it, he was free. But as he sat there in the flickering candlelight, the sheer scale of his predicament began to settle in. He was a 13-year-old boy, alone in an abandoned mine with a pregnant horse, with no food, no allies, and the most powerful man in the county surely hunting for him by now. The brief flicker of triumph was quickly being extinguished by a rising tide of despair. It was in that moment of utter exhaustion that his world shifted again. Leaning his head back against the wall to fight off the wave of hopelessness, his shoulder pressed against a section that felt different. It wasn't the solid, jagged surface of the rest of the rock. It was smooth, and it gave way slightly under his weight, with a low, grinding groan of wood against stone. His eyes snapped open. He pushed again, harder this time, and a perfectly fitted section of the wall, which he had mistaken for flat rock in the dim light, swung inward on hidden hinges. It was a door so cleverly camouflaged with rock dust and dark paint that it was virtually invisible. It revealed a small dark recess carved into the rock behind it, an alcove that had been deliberately and painstakingly hidden from the world. A new kind of fear, sharp and immediate, pierced through his exhaustion. He wasn't alone. The thought was a jolt of ice in his veins. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the rusted farrier's knife from his belt, his knuckles white. Holding the candle forward with a trembling hand, he peered into the opening. The space was small, no bigger than a deep closet, and thankfully it was empty of any person. But it was not empty of purpose. In the center of the small, man-made cave sat a weathered wooden crate, its lid shut tight. Beside it was a large bundle wrapped in thick, dark oilskin and tied securely with twine. They were not covered in the debris of a collapse. They were coated in only a fine, uniform layer of dust, as if they had been waiting patiently in the silent darkness for years. His fear slowly gave way to a profound and unnerving curiosity. This was not a miner's forgotten lunch pail. This was a deliberate cache, hidden with incredible care in a place everyone believed to be cursed and abandoned. He hesitated for a long moment, the silence of the mine pressing in on him. Every instinct told him to be wary, that this place held secrets he might not be prepared for. But the alternative was the crushing certainty of his own desperate situation. Whatever was in that alcove, it was a deviation from the bleak future he had imagined. With a deep, shuddering breath, he set the candle down on a nearby ledge and reached into the darkness, his fingers closing around the rough, splintery wood of the crate. He lifted it out into the main cavern. It was heavier than it looked, solid and well made. He worked the knife under the lid, prying it open with a soft, splintering sound that echoed in the vast, quiet space. He lifted the lid and held his candle over the contents, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried, fragrant herbs, was a collection of tools. They were not the heavy, rough tools of a miner, but the finer instruments of a carpenter or a builder, a small, sharp-toothed saw, a perfectly balanced hammer, a hand drill, and several leather pouches filled with nails, screws, and metal braces of different sizes. They were clean, well-oiled, and ready for use, as if they had been left there only yesterday. Beneath the tray of tools was something else. It was a thick, folded wool blanket, the same kind of heavy weave his mother had kept in their wagon for winter travel. It was clean and smelled faintly of cedar, and next to it, tucked into a corner of the crate, was a small, leather-bound book. It was not his father's journal. This one was smaller, its cover unmarked. He picked it up, his hands shaking so much he could barely hold it steady. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to cry, a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm him, though he did not yet understand why. He didn't know who had left these things, or for what purpose, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that this was not an accident. He sat back on the cold ground, the open crate before him, the small candle flame casting a warm glow on its impossible contents. The sheer loneliness that had been his constant shadow for 4 long years seemed to shrink in the presence of this discovery. He was still in a dark, dangerous place, hunted and with an uncertain future. But this crate, filled with tools for building and a blanket for warmth, was not an object of the past. It was an object of the future. It was a message of preparation. It was a whisper in the darkness that suggested his desperate, lonely fight for survival might not be as lonely as he had believed. For the first time, in the heart of a cursed mine, Caleb Stone Mercer felt a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. The arrival of Randolph Blackwood was not a surprise. It was an inevitability, as certain as the rising of the sun after the storm. He arrived on a black sleigh, his face a mask of cold fury, the ruin of his fortune etched into the lines around his eyes. He was not a man mourning his losses. He was a king surveying a rebellion. He pointed a gloved finger at Caleb, his voice cutting through the frigid air with the sharp crack of breaking ice. He declared that Caleb was his ward, and therefore every horse, every breath of life that had emerged from that mine belonged to him by law. The sheriff, a man long in Blackwood's pocket, shifted uncomfortably, his duty warring with the clear injustice of the moment. For Caleb, standing there in the blinding white snow, it felt as though the walls of the mine had dissolved, leaving him exposed and defenseless once more, his impossible victory about to be stolen from him by the same cold arithmetic that had condemned Esperanza in the first place. It was then that a figure emerged from the small crowd of onlookers, a woman so old and frail it seemed the wind might carry her away. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her back straight, her eyes fixed on Randolph Blackwood, with an intensity that burned through the years. This was Mrs. Dorothy Whitfield, a name known to all in the county, the last living widow of the Silver Creek mine disaster. She was a ghost from the town's past, a quiet, sorrowful woman who rarely left her home. Her presence alone was a shock, a disruption to the established order of things. She stopped beside Caleb, placing a thin, wrinkled hand on his shoulder, a small gesture of solidarity that felt as solid and unmovable as the mountain behind them. The sheriff took a step back, and even Blackwood's confident posture seemed to falter, a flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes. In her other hand, Mrs. Whitfield held a rolled-up yellow document tied with a faded blue ribbon. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet, unshakable clarity that carried farther than Blackwood's angry shouts. She informed the sheriff that Randolph Blackwood had no claim here. This land, and the mine that ran beneath it, did not belong to the county or to any mining conglomerate. It belonged to her. She unrolled the document, the paper crackling in the stillness. It was the original deed to the Silver Creek claim, signed over to her and the other mining families as a paltry settlement after the disaster of 1889. She stated that she had found Caleb working there weeks ago and had given him her verbal permission to use the mine as he saw fit. He was not a squatter or a thief. He was her guest. Blackwood scoffed, his arrogance returning. He called it a desperate trick, a senile woman's fantasy. He insisted the law was on his side, that guardianship superseded any such informal arrangement. But Mrs. Whitfield was not finished. She turned her gaze from Blackwood to the sheriff, and from a deep pocket in her heavy wool coat, she produced a second document. This one was not a deed. It was a small, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat, precise columns of numbers and dates. She explained that it was her late husband's private logbook. He had been the foreman, a man who believed in safety and procedure, and for 6 months leading up to the collapse, he had meticulously documented every one of Blackwood's cost-cutting measures, every ignored warning about unstable support beams, and every single bribe paid to the safety inspectors to sign off on a mine he knew was a death trap. A profound silence fell over the assembled men. The air itself seemed to freeze, every man's breath held captive in his chest. This was not about horses anymore. This was about 12 dead men, a town's unhealed wound, and a crime that had been buried under years of fear and influence. Mrs. Whitfield's voice, though quiet, was now an indictment, each word a hammer blow against the foundation of Blackwood's power. She was not just defending a boy, she was speaking for the dead. She was delivering a reckoning that had been simmering in the dark for 5 long years, waiting for a moment, waiting for a catalyst. The sheriff took the ledger from her hand, his face pale, his eyes scanning the damning entries. The truth, once hidden in the earth with the bodies of the miners, was finally seeing the light of day. Randolph Blackwood stood frozen, the color draining from his face. The mask of power and control shattered, revealing the hollow, craven man beneath. He looked from the ledger to the faces of the men surrounding him, men whose fathers and brothers he had sent to their graves, and he saw no allies. There was only a cold, quiet judgment. The sheriff, no longer a man in Blackwood's pocket but an officer of a law that had finally found its teeth, stepped forward. He did not need to say a word. He simply placed a hand on Blackwood's arm. The fight was over. As he was led away, a ruined man destined for a prison cell, Blackwood looked at Caleb one last time. There was no mockery in his eyes now, only a dawning, horrified understanding. He had not been defeated by a blizzard or by a boy. He had been defeated by his own cruelty, an evil so profound it had finally created a force of justice, strong enough to destroy him. After Blackwood was gone and the crowd began to disperse, murmuring in disbelief, Mrs. Whitfield turned to Caleb. He stood motionless, his mind struggling to comprehend the seismic shift that had just occurred. She looked at him, her eyes softening, and for the first time he saw not just a grieving widow but a guardian. She told him she had seen him weeks ago, hauling lumber up to the mine, working with a quiet determination that reminded her of her husband. She had watched him from a distance, curious about the boy who was drawn to a place of such sorrow. She confessed that she had been too afraid for too long to use the evidence she held, convinced that a man like Blackwood could never be touched. She then told him something that would reframe his entire struggle. She said she saw him one evening speaking softly to the pregnant mare, his hand resting on her side. In that simple, gentle act, she didn't see a desperate orphan. She saw the son of John Mercer, a man she remembered not for his fame, but for his fundamental decency, for his belief that every life had value. She saw a boy fighting for one life, not for profit or for glory, but simply because it was the right thing to do. She explained that his courage had shamed her own fear into silence. His quiet, solitary war against Blackwood's casual cruelty had given her the strength to finally fight her own. Caleb stared at her, the pieces of his life clicking into a new and astonishing arrangement. He had thought he was utterly alone, a forgotten boy waging a secret war in the dark. But he had not been alone. He had been seen, he had been understood. This quiet, elderly woman had been watching over him, a silent ally in a world he believed was entirely hostile. His struggle had not been a meaningless act of defiance. It had been the spark that lit a fire of long-delayed justice. He had not just saved his horses, he had, without knowing it, avenged the deaths of 12 men and freed an entire county from the shadow of a tyrant. The realization was a floodgate breaking inside him. The 4 years of solitude, of relentless work, of whispered insults and crushing loneliness, all of it came rushing to the surface. He had never cried in front of Blackwood, had never given him the satisfaction. But now, standing in the snow under the protective gaze of this woman who had seen the truth of him, the tears finally came. They were not tears of sorrow or of shame. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief, a cleansing torrent that washed away the last traces of the orphan boy who believed he was worthless. He did not sob loudly. He simply stood there as the silent tears streamed down his dirt-streaked face, each one a testament to a burden finally being set down. He was no longer just Caleb Stone Mercer, the orphan. He was the boy who had been seen, the boy who had been worthy of protection. He looked from Mrs. Whitfield to Esperanza, who nudged his arm gently, and to Ghost, the foal born in darkness, who now stood blinking in the bright, clean light of a new world. He finally understood the true legacy his father had left him. It was not a secret technique for taming horses. It was a simple, unshakable belief in the power of patience, of kindness, and of standing up for those who could not stand for themselves. It was a legacy that had been buried, but had never truly been lost. In the heart of a cursed mine, in the company of a discarded horse, he had found it again. And in the brave act of a grieving widow, he found something he thought he had lost forever: a family. The months that followed were a time of quiet reconstruction, both for the county and for Caleb himself. With Randolph Blackwood tried, convicted, and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor for manslaughter and fraud, a palpable weight was lifted from the community. The air itself seemed easier to breathe. For Caleb, the change was even more profound. In a simple courthouse ceremony, Mrs. Dorothy Whitfield, a woman who had lost her family in the darkness of the mine, formally adopted the boy who had found life there. He was no longer an orphan, no longer a ward or a stable hand. He had a home. He had a name that was given to him not out of obligation, but out of choice. He had someone who looked at him and saw not a tool to be used, but a son to be cherished. Together, Caleb and Mrs. Whitfield embarked on an endeavor that would have been unthinkable just a year prior. They transformed the Silver Creek mine from a place of tragedy and refuge into a symbol of innovation and resilience. They did not seal it up and forget it. They honored its protective power. With investment from ranchers who had witnessed Caleb's impossible survival, they turned the main cavern into Wyoming's first commercial subterranean stable. They reinforced the tunnels, installed proper ventilation, and built dozens of warm, dry stalls deep within the earth. It became a thriving business, a place where ranchers from 3 counties paid to shelter their most valuable animals during the harshest winter months, guaranteeing their survival against the brutal Wyoming elements. The rat hole had become a sanctuary. Ghost, the foal born in the deep, silent darkness, grew into a magnificent white stallion. He was the living embodiment of their story, a creature of impossible beginnings who possessed an incredible hardiness and a calm, intelligent spirit. He became the foundation of a new line of horses, the Mercer Whites, renowned not for a fancy Eastern pedigree but for their strength, their loyalty, and their uncanny ability to thrive in the most unforgiving conditions. Caleb, having quietly absorbed all of his father's wisdom, found that he had an innate gift for understanding these animals. He did not break them, he partnered with them. His father's journal, once a source of painful memory, became his guide, its lessons on patience and empathy, the cornerstones of his method. By the time he was 25, Caleb Stone Mercer was the most sought-after horseman in the West. People brought him their most difficult animals, not because he possessed some mystical secret, but because he had a reputation for quiet competence and profound respect for the creatures in his care. He moved with the same calm purpose he'd had as a boy leading his horses from the mine, a stillness that spoke of a deep inner peace. He never spoke of Randolph Blackwood again. He did not need to. His life was the only response that mattered. He had built a legacy of life, hope, and prosperity on the very ground where he had been told he would die of shame, turning an insult into an empire. Caleb lived to the age of 78, a respected and beloved figure who had helped shape the character of the county. He died peacefully, surrounded by his own family, leaving behind a thriving business and a legend that would be told for generations. He was buried on the hill overlooking the entrance to the Silver Creek mine, a place that had been both his tomb and his cradle. He had already chosen the words for his own epitaph, a final quiet act of defiance and pride, a message to the past and a lesson for the future. The simple stone marker bore his name, his dates, and a single, unadorned sentence that perfectly captured the spirit of his incredible life. He raised horses in a rat hole. He never regretted it.